Well, great. I'd like to welcome our internet audience back to our penultimate presentation in our Unsilencing the Archives lecture series. And before I get on to introducing today's speaker, I would like to hand the floor over to our curator, Melissa Craddock, who will read our introductory statement. Melissa.
Thank you, Aaron. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Kutchin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders, both past and present. We're living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past, wherein even our most venerated figures deserve reasonable scrutiny. During his time directing the archaeological excavations at Taha, W.F. Bade participated in harmful stereotyping of local populations that was common among white Americans and Europeans conducting fieldwork in traditional Palestine. Some of these attitudes appear in print in his popular 1934 book, A Manual of Excavation in the Near East. Museums are also scrutinizing their collections, including evaluating the legal status and ethics with which they were acquired. As stewards of the legacy of the Bade Museum and its holdings, it is our responsibility to faithfully evaluate the process by which the collections were acquired within the context of our contemporary moment. One approach is to ask new questions of the archival materials in order to examine critically the manner and impact of archaeological work on Indigenous communities to investigate the colonial conditions in which it played a part. The Bade Museum recognizes that its location and collection are part of ongoing and painful colonial legacies that contributed to historical inequalities. These legacies have directly and indirectly impacted populations locally and abroad in Palestine, where the excavations were conducted under the authority of the British government of Palestine. In an effort to bring light to these issues, to serve a broader public audience online, and to connect to the local community that it serves, the museum is taking action to become a more inclusive, welcoming, and equitable institution that practices the philosophy of radical inclusion adopted by its parent institution, Pacific School of Religion. One of these steps is the creation of open access web exhibits and public programming like this lecture series, which highlight decolonizing themes. We invite you to participate in these programs so that together we can listen, learn, and work toward creating a more inclusive museum community. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Craddock. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Helen Dixon. Dr. Dixon currently serves as Assistant Professor of History at East Carolina University in the UNC system, where she teaches ancient Near Eastern and classical history alongside courses on public history and museum studies. So her research is a perfect fit for this series. Her research focuses on Phoenician history and religion, exploring the ways mortuary practice can be used to reconstruct social history in the first millennium BCE. The project she will be speaking about today draws on archival work conducted at the University of Michigan, where she received her PhD in Near Eastern Studies in 2013. And I might just add, she is a recent Getty Fellow, just returning from a research time in Malibu. So Dr. Dixon, welcome, welcome, welcome. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I want to extend a personal thank you to Aaron for even remembering that I ever did this research and started it about 10 years ago. Truly impressive memory. And it was a real joy to come back to a project like this after so long and see the sort of richness of this collection with some new research questions in mind. So I'm going to be talking today about sort of a strange collection of archival work centered on this character circled in red, Horton ONeill, who was a teenage volunteer on excavations in the French Protectorate of Tunisia in 1924 and 1925. And I wanted to look in particular, this was collections motivated research. I wanted to look at his souvenirs, right? When we think of souvenirs today, if you've ever been a volunteer on an excavation, you might think of something like a reproduction of a Roman lamp, some small little thing to take home as a memento. It meant something very different to Horton ONeill, and I'm going to explore that here with some research in progress. So I'll start by talking about this character himself. He goes by Hort. I'm going to use his papers to talk about the logistics of excavations at Carthage, the really interesting textured information we can get from his letters, correspondence, notes, and scrapbooks, as you'll see, on how those excavations were run and organized. We're going to get into a little bit on the attitudes towards local workers evinced in his writings. And we're going to sort of lead into, finally, his attitudes towards portable antiquities and souvenirs from his time in Tunisia and across the Mediterranean world. So starting with the first question, who was Horton ONeill and why should we care? Horton was born in 1907, and that means that when he excavated at Carthage, he was 16 and 17 years old. This was, by all records I can find, his only archaeological experience. He was a volunteer. He came from boarding school in Paris to join these excavations. I still don't totally understand how he got roped into all of this, but this was before he ever entered university at Princeton. He eventually became an architect, married a famous dancer, Madeline Hyde Phillips, had 2 children, really had an interesting and varied life, was relatively well off, and eventually passed away at the age of 89, at which time his New York Times obituary described him as archaeologist, architect, sculptor. So this identity as an archaeologist follows him throughout his life and is something he really celebrates and returns to in his own depictions of himself, representations of himself, and of course his interests and friendships. Another reason we should care about Horton ONeill is that his collections can be found across Harvard, Princeton, and the University of Michigan's archaeological collections and university museums. So again, he excavated in the mid-20s. 40 years later, he made his first donation to Harvard, a collection of stamped amphora handles and objects. That was published in the Harvard Studies in Classical Philology in 1968. And the sort of narrative that accompanies the scientific presentation of these pieces describes ONeill as a volunteer member of a Franco-American staff for the excavation of Carthage during the spring seasons of 24 and 25, and says that his own accounting of the material Harvard acquired describes his acquisition as he used to walk to the excavations from the village of Sidi Bou Said and picked up pieces in the fields. He occasionally traded pieces with the French scholar François Icard, discoverer of the precinct of Tanit. We're going to return to this story later because it changes quite a bit if you look into his personal papers. But that's the sort of official story that Harvard presents of the collection it acquired in the 1960s. A second donation followed pretty soon after. That second donation contained 8 further boxes, and there's a sort of good record keeping of what was acquired at that time. You can view the ONeill collection and Harvard Art Museum's online site, and it includes, a lot of ceramic material, some ivory, and at least one cremated, the cremated remains of an infant from this Tanit excavation at Carthage. In 1981, a second institution was the recipient of Horton ONeill's collections, Antiquities collections. This donation was facilitated by Francis Jones, who was the curator of the time, and it seems clear from the documentation that Michigan has about that donation that Francis visited the ONeills in their home, picked a representative group in consultation with the ONeills, and then quite a bit was left behind for them to enjoy. And after Horton ONeill passed away in 1997, his wife, Madeline, made a third donation to the University of Michigan, 79 physical artifacts and the papers of Horton ONeill. And that collection is where I did most of my research in around 2012. The Kelsey Museum of Archaeology has given me permission to talk about this material today, and thank you for that, has this incredible series of boxes containing 8 separate scrapbooks that Horton ONeill put together documenting his life from 1903 to 1925. So the last 4 of those volumes of scrapbooks contain information related to his travels in North Africa and his excavation experience. They include drafts of typed letters, right? He would draft letters to his family and then copy them out again with all the corrections made and send them off. We have some letters from family members, we have photos, and of course we have the ceramic collection, some of which include, again, cremated infant remains. I was able to study those collections, and I was working on them as a sort of element of Phoenician collecting, Punic artifacts collected by American institutions when I came across all of this rich archival material. So it's from those papers, the papers of Horton ONeill, that I'd like to explore some of what he sort of indirectly points to in terms of logistics of these excavations going on in 1924 and 25 in Carthage. So of course, Carthage is a coastal site, the northern coast of Tunisia there, but Carthage itself is an enormous preserved ancient city. And we have, just in the 2 years that he's there, several excavations mentioned by Horton ONeill. So there is sort of one area at the Temple of Tanit. Most of the time, Horton describes this just as Tanit, but this is the so-called Tophet site, the sort of infant cremation cemetery with hundreds of inscribed stelae marking either sacrificed infants or perhaps, miscarriages and early neonatal deaths. That have been sort of given to the gods for a replacement child, depending on your position on that. There's the Hill of Juno, the Roman Forum, Punic ports. Those are all separate elements of Carthage that were sort of in various stages of excavation while Horton ONeill was there. The site of Utica, just north of Carthage, that Horton works at in 1925. He references several trips taken to Duga, which has also been excavated for about 10 years at the point that Horton is there. And then there's a reference, I'd be really interested if anyone has leads on this, a reference to the Hogarth with a definite article. This is described as an excavation that has been postponed until fall 1925 after Horton has left, and I haven't been able to figure out what that site is. Had some leads that are all dead ends as far as I know. So how did the excavations Horton was privy to work? Some of the details he gives us are, again, just sort of really amusing, charming, letters home. So he writes to his brother in 1924 that there are 10 in the party, and by this he means Western staff members who have assembled to oversee excavations at Carthage in his little group. 7 boys and 3 girls. The average age I discovered today to be 23, and I don't seem to be at all out of place at the time. He's 16 years old. As the Count trusts me to manage the whole excavation when he's busy, attend to personal notes in French, or drive his car to Tunis any day of the week should I take the notion. Sort of a shocking thing to imagine a 16-year-old doing. And we don't know how much of this depiction is bravado, right? Writing to a brother, trying to show off a little bit. But certainly there is some support for this claim borne out in the rest of his papers. These scrapbooks are a joy to peruse. He's carefully sort of sketching out lines to keep them straight, pasting in all sorts of material and illustrating in some cases that material further. So here is illustrations of several sort of day trips that the crew took to visit sites. Again, a lot of folks wearing pith helmets for no obvious excavation related reasons, but a mixed gendered group of Western individuals who are touring the sites. And of course, you can see already here his little drawing, his sketch identifying who's who in the picture at the top of the page. Some of these names will be familiar to those of you who work in either historiography or Punic and Phoenician studies for sure. Sort of charming little cartoon legends. And sometimes he offers teenage boy style labels to photos. In this case, he identifies here the Abbé Chabot of the French Academy and describes his nickname, the Shabby Abbot, for the boys at the site. He also cuts out clippings from newspapers published in 1924 and 1925 to sort of provide further commentary and probably also, prestige, right? These publications, media coverage of the excavations add to the feeling that he has that he's responsible for something really important and exciting. In this case, this is that same abbot. The published news clipping says, an expert reads the records of a vanished civilization. The Abbé Chabot, one of the foremost authorities on the Punic language, deciphers an inscription, et cetera, and Horton adds the comment, no comment from the well-mannered company, right? This is all very, very fancy and highfalutin sounding. I know this guy to be a little bit of a silly old man, right? Some of the transcribed letters go a little bit further, and here I'm going to use the language of a teenage boy in 1925, so I apologize for the terminology he chose. But in this lovely letter to his mother, Hort says, I could never be an archaeologist with these human freaks representing the fellows I would have in the trade. Hashtag relatable. He goes on to really caricature the bear of our zoo, Professor Swain, et cetera. And then at the very bottom of your screen, all the Michigan representatives are alike, with the exception of Professor Kelsey, who I'm sure isn't far removed, right? I don't know that guy very well. He's got a certain gravitas, but I'm sure if I got to know him, he'd be a weirdo too. So this is the lens through which we have to experience these papers, right? A lot of sort of making fun of the characters in the story, making himself look great, a lot of cleverness and backhanded sarcasm, all that kind of stuff. Hort is also documenting the locations where the team worked. I actually have no idea how he got this top picture, Cape Carthage from the air. That's super fascinating. Maybe a hot air balloon. Somehow he was able to come across an image of the site. I don't think he took that one himself, though he does have, he talks about his new camera that he received before the excavation in 1924. The Palais Hamukar is where the dig team stayed, and we've got images of the living room there. And then portraits in various states of sort of casualness of all of the team members headed out with their equipment to the site, etc. He also keeps addresses for future correspondence with some of these staff. So that's a helpful way to sort of track where these characters went after they disassembled the team. And we can check Horton ONeill's recollections and notes against the published preliminary report of the 1925 excavations put together by Francis Kelsey. This is the Kelsey of the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. Kelsey was a classics professor at the University of Michigan who really started to sort of raise money to go on these multi-year expeditions to accumulate antiquities, but also to sort of finance excavations. And he was, at least in name, a director of the excavations at Carthage. He organized some funding. He wasn't in the field the whole time, but he had this important role to play at that site. And of course, in 1953, the University of Michigan named the Archaeological Museum for him in his honor. But in that publication, Kelsey describes Horton ONeill of New York, not associated with any institution, right? He's a teenager, not at a university, in a list of volunteers who at different times took an active part in the work, rendering service as inspectors in charge of the Arab workmen, and in other ways as the need might arise. And already, of course, we have that distinction between volunteers who are going to be named, experts who are going to be given, in conjunction with their titles and their credentials, and then Arab workmen who will not be named in this publication. In fact, the Carthage Leadership in 1925, according to the Kelsey publication, is extensive. Those first three with blue titles all represent the leadership at the highest level, the chairman, the director, and the associate general director there. And in fact, we know that Kelsey was largely absent. De Prorock ended up in a kind of scandal wherein like a lot of institutions withdrew funding because he was considered to be sort of unscientific excavator and also maybe a social climber in some really classist language of the time. Those green titles that come next sort of represent the subject matter experts, those that would have had training already in Punic antiquities in particular, the time and culture of the site that was being excavated. And then the others, an architect, a photographer, an engineer, would have been associated more with sort of setting up the excavation and recording properly. The four with stars by their names are those that are mentioned most often in Horton ONeill's notes. He works very closely with Abbé Chabot. He spends a lot of time with Delattre and de Prorac, and then Henry Washington gives him advice at several points that he writes home about. There's also some interesting New York Times clippings that give further information about logistics on the excavation, and in particular, one article that he clips describes women undertaking the delicate task of sorting incinerated fragments. That is, specifically women who were working on the excavation, again, Western women, who are named in that article as sort of a special interest piece. Isn't this fascinating that there might be women on this site? Although the fourth woman listed in the article is, listed as Mrs. Frances Kelsey and doesn't have her full name recorded. But these were research fellows from the University of Michigan and the American Academy in Rome, who were there sort of doing the careful study work with the human remains, a sort of exciting bioarchaeological project. In Horton's notes and descriptions of his day-to-day work, he gives us quite a lot to chew on, involving sort of being able to picture the day-to-day negotiations of who's working on what where. So this is just one example. He writes, "I spent a longer day than usual at Tanit with the Abbé Chabot. All the others had gone to Duga for the day, and we were left to our own devices. As I cleared away the earth around each of the 14 urns we discovered, Monsieur l'Abbé recorded and tagged the find and climbed up to the storage shed with it in a basket." So, I mean, this is a kind of familiar description to anyone who's worked on excavation, right? Like, you have your baskets, you're moving them to and fro, you have a storage shed on site, you are sometimes working with very few people in a square. While this isn't a scientific excavation of the 2020s, there are some familiar elements that really bring alive how these excavations worked day to day. And it also makes me think of Rachel Sparks's excellent slide, sort of detailing the dig hierarchy pyramid in her April contribution to this series. It makes me think about this, we have our sponsors, we have the director, the Western staff piece of this. It's really easy to sort of flatten that section of the pyramid out and say, well, Western staff would have been university professors who are there for their expert knowledge. But here in the 1920s at Carthage, we're including a 16-year-old writing home to his brother about how to play tetherball in Western staff, alongside women research associates, alongside 60-year-old folks who have lived their whole life in Carthage as part of the French Academy there. So a real sort of depth to that piece, but also at this particular excavation and from this particular archive, a flattening of all the sections of the dig hierarchy below, as you'll see. When we look at attitudes towards local workers as sort of implied and evinced in Horton ONeill's papers, a lot of it is what you expect. Right? This is a pretty typical picture that depicts workmen, but also, it's pretty clear that there was no, hey guys, I'm going to take a picture, look up here. The point isn't to photograph the identity of the workmen in this photo. This is an action scene sort of showing the joy of discovery, asking you to identify with the supervisor, the person looking and watching the workmen and supervising the work. So in this case, we have, again, a caption here saying, under Abbé Chabot's direction, Duff, Hardin, Ray, and I went to work with the help of 4 Arabs not named. Right? So that's pretty typical, to name off every Western individual that is working with you, and then to summarize or quantify other workmen with no stated identity. This is a second example, some of that texture In this case, while the four of us, that is Western staff, were thus engaged with the meticulous part of the work, the four Arabs, each with a long-handed shovel, tossed the earth in relays to successively higher levels until it reached a two-wheeled cart with a mule standing patiently in the shafts. Right, so that distinction again between they're doing collective work, it's unskilled work, it's of no scientific merit, it requires supervision, and the rest of us are doing the meticulous part of the work. In this particular set of papers, we have only 2 personal names recorded for workmen across those 2 years of excavation with multiple months each. The first is Hassan, a simple personal name. I have no gentilic, I have no patronymic, I don't really have any leads or ways to trace this back to a larger group or individual's identity at the time. But this particular excerpt says, the 4 laborers whose services we hardly needed were no concern to us, as Hassan had been put in charge of them, with Juneau shut down for lack of a supervisor. So a kind of interesting and difficult sentence to parse, but my read of this sentence is that those workmen are being overseen by one Hassan, but there's no supervisor, right? There's no staff person put in charge of them. They're a separate sort of group that work cannot continue because there is no Western staff person to supervise. This is the second personal name that we find in Horton ONeill's papers. This is described as a work gang at Juneau. Muhammad, foreman with white beard, is the only individual identified from this group of maybe a dozen men. So you can see Muhammad with the white beard here, sort of third from the right, but that's the only name we have from this picture. We've got the mule here too. And even the placement in the scrapbook on the right-hand side, this is what you see when you open that page of the scrapbook. This story from a Paris newspaper is actually folded over maybe a quarter or a third of that photo. It's tucked behind. It's not as important in terms of preserving the memories that that Horton wanted to preserve in these scrapbooks. We get in his letters home a little more detail about variety in his experiences with workmen. And in particular, in 1925, in February and March, Horton was working at Utica, a site just north of Carthage, and he's conscious of the differing ethnic and linguistic backgrounds of the workmen there. So whereas at Carthage, no matter where he's working, he always describes workmen as Arabs. At Utica, he says, I had gangs of workmen excavating in all parts of the ruins, Arabs, Sicilians, Maltese, Italians, and French, that I had to keep separated so as not to have too many wars. And he goes on to really detail the incredible amount of responsibility he's given over these adult men's livelihoods. So Horton says, again, in a letter to his father, so maybe a little bit of exaggeration, but we're going to keep that in mind. I kept the accounts and dealt out the funds as I liked. When there were misunderstandings and the men were discontent, there were strikes and feuds and wars. I fired whole gangs at a time and sent for more in Benzart to come and take their places and live with the rest in the Roman cisterns. So they're actually camping inside Roman cisterns at the site. That's how these men are being brought in from a larger urban center to come do this seasonal work. He goes on, the wages range from 5 to 18 francs per day, according to the nationality and the customary pay of the districts in which we found them. So there is no set wage rate. There are individual negotiations going on with groups of men in different languages. At one point, he even talks about bringing in a linguist to try to negotiate further because he speaks French pretty well, but the rest is really challenging. And how much is 5 to 18 francs per day? Well, that's a pretty enormous range, no matter how you cut it for a daily wage for a full day's work. But I can give you a relative reference point in his letters. Horton describes his own expenses for lodging and food. He is paying out 30 francs a day to support himself, a young teenage boy with no dependents, right? Eventually his costs are taken on by the expedition at Carthage, but that record comes within a month of his indication that he is paying this wage of, again, 5 to 18 francs per day. So he's aware he's paying out 2 to 6 times what he's paying these adult men with dependents to work for the excavation. This information on attitudes towards local workers carries over into the final sort of question I was asking of these materials. I wanted to know about his attitudes towards portable antiquities and souvenirs, how this translates into the collections at Harvard, Princeton, and Michigan. In his writings, in this case to his mother, he writes about his responsibility and characterizes it as, besides keeping the Arabs at work, I have to watch every move they take in case of one finding something of value and pocketing it, or of putting it into his mouth, as is very common. Right, so this is described as sort of one of his major supervisory roles. He's watching that everyone does what they're supposed to be doing. He's watching to see who's working how much they should be paid per day based on productivity. And then his job is to keep them from taking anything off the site. And in contrast, he writes, in this case to his father, of urns and Greek lamps that he finds, that is, that he excavates in the course of the excavations he's overseeing. He describes 9 or 10 of them in perfect condition without a single scratch or crack. One of these urns, these excavated urns, I find I shall take to Paris when I come so you can see it. The Count is really too generous. He'd have me take everything away should I let him. Right, so describing himself as a kind of golden child of those who are overseeing the excavation, giving him permission to take excavated antiquities away, to sort of show his family, to keep, to collect. And in fact, that this is not the first time it's been offered. He's getting generous offers of things he could take back. So again, this contrasts quite a bit with that 1960s depiction in print, the publication of describing him as simply, collecting surface finds on his walk to the excavation site, picking them up in the fields, trading them with others who live nearby, who are also, good, respectable academics. Instead, in the letters home, we really see that contrast between the workmen who must be stopped at all costs from taking anything, whereas he's been given sort of carte blanche to take items straight out of excavation back to Paris with him. In a 1974 narrative that I suspect is actually just sort of based on notes that Horton ONeill had written at the time. The detail is really specific. He describes visiting Icard in his cramped little office the day before he leaves in 1925. And he says, he performs his duties as chief of police in the midst of burgeoning accumulation of antiquities. And I don't know how much of this is a joke, if he's actually serving as chief of police, if that's an official title, or if this is, again, kind of a tongue-in-cheek characterization of Icard. But in any case, he's got collections and collections sort of in his office. And Horton says, we had planned this meeting sometime earlier. He had meanwhile put together a collection of objects I had offered to buy from him. Some of these are tomb objects from Carthage, which implies that they would have been taken from the very site that he was excavating at and Icard was overseeing. And then after his departure, he writes further, and this is down at the bottom of your screen, with Icard, my only friend on the pier, to say goodbye, he was there to make sure there was no hitch in taking my antiquities through customs. This is what makes me think maybe he was serving as chief of police, but certainly in the sense of the sort of French colonial bureaucratic structure, hoping to smooth things along. And as you'll see, that story of no hitch in taking my antiquities through customs had a sort of prologue. In the letter that comes closest in time from his actual departure date, this is a May 8th, 1925 letter to his mother, Horton actually confesses to illegally exporting everything he took from Carthage. So he writes from Palermo, I spent my last night in Tunis and early next morning before the customs opened, found a douanier, I don't really know what this officer is, and persuaded him with a 5-franc note to stamp my baggage and send it on board the little steamer without inspection. It was a very necessary act, as my trunk was bulging with antiques that I hadn't been able to get permits for with the poinceau or poincé troubles. And this is another thing I've spent way too long trying to figure out what this is. Poincé or poinceau, he spells it both ways in different letters. He's definitely an academic. He's written some stuff, but I can't figure out what the troubles were. Until now, there hasn't really been any use in telling you of the wonderful junk I'm collecting, for just as easily as not, it might all have been confiscated leaving Tunisia. What is he talking about here? What are these antiquities or antiques? He goes on in this letter to really itemize what he means by souvenirs, what he means by antiques, how much he has been collecting, and it's jaw-dropping. So he describes one set of 7 big cases, 7 big cases like steamer trunks sent to Paris. But that's not all. All the rest, except for one box of urns I sent you in the States 2 weeks ago, is safely in Palermo. So he's got some other quantity of trunks in Palermo. Among the ponderous junk of the 7 cases, that first set that went to Paris, were 70 Greek and Punic pottery inscriptions. And he describes, a collection of collections here with a lot of individual histories, some of which have already been published, a very complete collection of 60 prehistoric implements purchased from an officer from the Sahara, endless miscellaneous Punic and Roman pottery, bowls, glazed plates and cups, bronze and terracotta statuettes, fragments of statuary, lamps from all the periods, 20 off pottery tear bottles. These are unguentaria, but the finest pieces I have are in Palermo. And he goes on to further characterize these collections and itemize the gems of the collection. These are from the Palermo materials, 2 rare 6th century Punic vases from the necropolis of Dumé, different site entirely, a Roman bronze sacrificial frying pan-like vessel, and a Punic 4th century glass bottle, beautifully painted. The other day, Washington suggested that if I am ever in need of money, I can sell them to any American museum for a great deal. He talks about the academic publications he's acquired. And besides these, I have the only collection of Tanit Estampi outside of the sets I made for the Academy in Michigan. And he details in the letters a lot of time and energy. He was put in charge of making squeezes of the entire Tanit precinct, all the inscriptions that they had to that point. He had to make multiple copies for Michigan, for McGill, for the French Academy, etc. But apparently he also took some home for his private collection. So this is not ambiguous. We have in his letter to his mother, May 8th, a confession that he had to bribe an officer to stamp his baggage so that it would not be inspected because he did not have any permits. And in a sort of rare situation for historiography, we have very clear Tunisian antiquities laws in place in the 1920s. So remember, at this time, Tunisia is a French protectorate. In 1886, they had already passed a decree on the protection of antiquities and art objects. In 1920, again, 4 to 5 years before any of this, there was even more specific language outlining the distinction that should be made to those antiquities prior to the Arab conquest versus post-Arab conquest. And it's very clear that anything from this period, the Punic ancient material, requires the director of the Service of Antiquities and Arts to investigate it, to examine it, to make sure that this isn't of value to the Tunisian people, to issue an export permit, and then that's how you remove material from Tunisia. The penalties are also very clear. In the 1886 law, a fine of between 500 and 5,000 francs and seizure or confiscation of the objects is the penalty, but those were strengthened in the 1920s decree, a fine of between 100 and 1,000 dinars, or imprisonment for between 3 and 12 months, or both fine and imprisonment, in addition to seizure of all of the archaeological property. So these are the sort of clear penalties and stakes in law at the time that Horton ONeill is sneaking stuff out in, whatever, 20 crates. And I don't think that Horton ONeill was aware of these laws in their specifics. Certainly he writes just as easily as not, it might all have been confiscated. That seems to be the only thing he was really afraid of, at least what he admitted to his mother. So all of this is sort of interesting to look at in light of later attempts to sell some of the collection. In 1989, he wrote to the Ariadne Gallery to sort of inquire as to, whether they'd be interested in purchasing some of this material. He outlines the most important items in the collection, to me at least, and describes specifically the material from Carthage. And then adds, as I worked in the Carthage excavations during the 24 and 25 seasons and acquired the Etruscan pieces from a Florentine friend who was the son of the finder with exact knowledge of where they were found in the mid-20s, I can vouch for their having been properly excavated and witnessed. So it's clear that even in later writings, he's more worried about the developing UNESCO laws and sort of attitudes, changing attitudes to antiquities as illegally excavated or not, or I should say provenanced or not, versus the illegal exportation at the time that he left Tunisia in 1925. So this is the research in progress as I've been able to construct it to this point. I think that the implications and next steps for this research are really exciting. I look forward to exploring the implications for the collections holding institutions. Obviously, these are likely not the kinds of things that would be good candidates for repatriation because we don't have clear excavation notes. There are, hundreds of duplicates of these urns and stele impressions, but this might change some of the ways that these materials are framed in the galleries, and it might still have implications for communication between the current government of Tunisia and these collections holding institutions. I think that it would be really exciting for me to get into exploring other archives associated with Carthage, other of the members of leadership, given O'Neill's youth and the audience for his papers, right? Often in family members that he wants to impress, just to try to get other sort of viewpoints and perspectives from people at different life stages and with different interests, sort of answering some of these questions about attitudes towards local workmen and logistics of the dig. And of course, I have been thinking quite a lot since resuming this research about attitudes of archaeological volunteers and later, how much impact our student volunteers can have through their lifetimes after participating in excavation. And this isn't just impact on the scientific community. A lot of them, don't become professors, don't go into publishing. But Horton ONeill spent 2 summers, spring and summer, of his teenage years excavating. And throughout his life, because of this incredible collection of souvenirs, because he kept reaching out and making relationships with folks on the basis of this teenage experience, he really had an outsized impact on the study of the ancient Near East at Harvard, Princeton, and Michigan, and probably quite a few individuals he encountered along the way. So I imagine if I were running a field school right now, I love the idea of assigning a digital or physical scrapbook as a kind of archival project, right? What is your experience as a volunteer? How do you describe things? What kinds of clippings would you assemble to sort of look at the volunteer experience as another lens through which to see excavation as an institution? So in any case, research is a team sport. I wanted to call out at least a few folks who really facilitated this work and had some great leads for me over the years in the 2 phases of this research. And I have my email address down on the screen as well, in case anybody has follow-up ideas for me about the Hogarth or who Poinsett is or what his troubles were or anything else I spoke about today. Thank you so much for your time and for inviting me.
Helen, thank you so much for sharing this incredibly illuminating talk with us. I'd like to invite the live YouTube audience to submit any questions or comments you might have into the YouTube chat box. I'll start us off with a question of my own. So your talk raised many really critical issues about ethics and provenience and archaeological labor. And as an audience member listening to this narrative unfold about Horton ONeill, I was continually surprised and also troubled by what you were sharing with us. So my first question to you is, what did you find most surprising as you were going through these archives?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I was surprised quite often. First of all, there's like just continually having my jaw drop at how 16-year-olds talked in the 1920s. It's really just a lot to take in. And I had to stop reading his letters with a, hey, see, kind of wise guy attitude, because it's really different. But I think the big surprise for me was watching how adaptive the narrative about how he got these antiquities and how sort of legitimate they are changed depending on audience, right? So he seems to slowly, like, he tells almost no one his intentions before he leaves, although it's clear that he had to negotiate with Icard about buying some collections on site. He's getting encouragement to take stuff home, but he's not writing home about the collecting process. It's only once he breathes a sigh of relief after sneaking all these antiquities out that he writes home and tells his mother, this was such a close call, man, you're going to see all the stuff I got. And then I'm absolutely surprised at the quantity. I mean, I cannot believe how much stuff. I mean, this is a kid, like he wouldn't have even been able to carry half of it one by one fireman relay. It's just a stunning amount of stuff that very understandably shaped his life. I mean, it was like a house worth of antiques. And 3 institutions have had collections of hundreds of objects, or at least 79 objects, plus boxes and boxes and boxes of papers resulting from that teenage collecting spree. So I think that the surprises have been in sort of degree and scope of what he got away with, in a way. But it's hard not to be charmed by the story too, because it's being told in his little, sort of breaking the rules, unaware, oblivious, impulsive teenage voice.
Yeah, thank you. And also the short span of time, that huge amount of material.
I mean, that's what's so crazy. Like, obviously it is, excavation was a lot longer than it is now, right? These folks camped out for 3 or 4 months at one site, sort of getting material in a nonstop everyday way. But to look at how much stuff he acquired, as I think most of it was just in that last summer, that last 1925 season. I agree. Good point.
And I also want to reiterate one of the comments that you just made, which is so important, is the issue of audience. And it's a great reminder of always keeping a critical view and looking through the archives, especially the letters, right? Depending on who they're addressed to, who they're coming from, and how that narrative changes. So I think it's really important that you have these different tones and different kinds of storytelling from one single actor, Horton ONeill, to these different people, including both of his parents, who I guess you might assume aren't reading each other's letters from their son.
Yeah. In some cases, they're in totally different cities. Yeah. I think you're right.
Yeah. So another question that I have, could you discuss in a little bit more detail some of the original motives and goals that inspired your archival work at Kelsey? And you talked a little bit about where you're going to take it. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing more about how the project began.
Yeah, that's a generous question. Thank you. Yeah, when I was a graduate student, I was also in the certificate program in in museum studies at Michigan. And I was thinking about my dissertation on Phoenician mortuary practice and wishing we had more collections that sort of informed that research. And then I remember it was like word of mouth. Someone was like, we actually I think we have Tophet burials in the collections. They're not on display. And my mind was blown. I was like, wait a minute, what? Like, I couldn't really wrap my head around, like, okay, well, this must have been because there was a portage arrangement, and Michigan got a bunch from the Carthaginian excavation. Must have been Kelsey that somehow got this here. I just had no idea how the human remains had been exported and brought to Michigan. So I was studying that. And in fact, I was, the reason Erin knows about this at all is because I was preparing a proposal for an ASOR paper on sort of like thinking about how ASOR was developing its own ethics policies at the time around, you know, what is okay to present at the meeting, what is okay to publish in our series, what counts as a first publication, right? If we're only willing to be the first publication of material that has been properly scientifically excavated, what does it mean to say, well, we're grandfathering in stuff that has been published elsewhere? And the problem I saw with that was that museum catalogs, if they count as a first publication for unprovenanced or poorly provenanced or illegally exported antiquities, then a museum's ethical sort of imperative to make its collections accessible to the public comes into direct conflict with our field's ethical imperative to present and prioritize scientifically excavated materials, right? Because now you can potentially cite anything that's ever been in a museum catalog as, well, it's already been published, so we're just going to keep working with this illegal material or problematic material or looted material, et cetera. And so this seemed like a really growingly fascinating case study of Michigan has this stuff. Oh, it's not from controlled excavations. Oh, it's from a volunteer, a teenage volunteer who actively snuck it out of Tunisia. And yet the Kelsey wants to present this to the public, and ASOR seemingly would allow it. So my first paper I gave on the subject was talking about this loophole. And the second paper I wanted to give about it was, what should the Kelsey Museum do with these? And we never got to that point because Christina Brody is amazing and she filled her session way past capacity. And so my paper was deferred, and meanwhile I had to start a new job, but that was the original impetus. Yeah, sorry, that was long, but thank you for that question. That was very nice.
Yeah, thanks for telling us. You know, it's always interesting to see how projects develop over time, especially as you stumble on material that might be unexpected. So yeah, sort of a bigger picture question here. I think one of the trends that has come out of this project and this lecture series as a whole, among the different talks and the different archives that we've seen, which have mostly been based around American or British excavation projects, is that we see these quite inexperienced and oftentimes young Westerners being put in charge of a field site. So whether it's even the site director himself, who maybe had very little or no field training prior to somehow being granted a permit to excavate a site, or someone like Horton ONeill, who's at 16 years old, basically appointed interim director in the absence of other supervisors, although there were seemingly plenty of other experienced and older staff members that you noted. So was there any indication of tension or conflict with this promotion of a 16-year-old with very little expertise among either the Western staff members or the workers that he was supervising? Is that drawn out at all in the archives? And is there any indication either of whether and how Horton ONeill was leaning on other people's expertise in order to do his job?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it really is incredible. And I appreciate so much the accidental tallying that he does at that one point where he's like, the average age is 23. So amazingly, I fit right in. And that, I mean, to me, that indicates, okay, we know that Abbe Chabot is in his 60s, so everybody else has got to be just super young relative to our, supervisory structures today. And I think some of this is, I mean, it's clear in his letters home that there's a tension between wanting to be seen by his father in particular as extremely capable and responsible, but also like his fears seem to be around being accused of being a playboy. So in the passage about getting to drive the Count's car anytime he wants, he makes a sort of passing comment to his brother, like, also, if dad reads this letter, or like if dad asks you about it, the answer is, I almost never drive. Don't worry about it. Like, I'm not driving in Tunisia. Okay, calm down. So I think that he's afraid of getting in trouble with his father, who he clearly respects and longs to come and admire him. But in terms of interacting with staff, I would say that he is really caught up in a fake it till you make it kind of model. So we get these indirect references to how he's like reading for the first time a very basic primary source. And he's like, whoa, like, did you know they sacrifice their children? And, you know, it's sort of like, well, that would be the impetus for the whole excavation. Yes, we should know that at this point if you're supervising. So he's sort of playing catch up the whole time he's in charge, but the pressure to just be capable, just pretend you're authoritative I mean, it must have been frightening for him to be like basically improving his French, trying to speak with folks from all kinds of different, you know, linguistic backgrounds, really trying to navigate a brand new social situation. He has almost he has almost nothing to say about the women on the site. Like, he just doesn't talk about them at all. They show up in the cuttings from the newspapers, but he's probably a little bit nervous about the co-ed interactions. So we can speculate quite a bit through the bravado that we see. But as far as we can tell, all of his self-presentations are that I'm nailing this, I'm crushing it. You know, like, you would be so proud of me. I'm doing this and that. And it's so conflict heavy. And I'm in control. At one point he says, I can think of nothing better than to be in control of the richest excavation in Africa. You know, he's an explorer. So, you know, I think to all of us, the tension is present, but he's not self-aware. He's not presenting it that way.
Mm-hmm. He's an explorer, but he also derides his fellow explorers. A lot of interesting dynamics there. Speaking of women, this might be a very straightforward answer. You just mentioned that he barely discusses them. But we do know, as you told us, that there were some women from the University of Michigan and from the American Academy in Rome doing some specialized excavation tasks. Sounded like it was mostly finds processing related. Were there women among the field workforce that you've been able to find in these archives?
Oh my God, I'm dying to know that. Yeah, that was one of the questions I have been sort of desperate to find other clues about this. I think the hope would be that Utica would have some better records, because the ratio of Westerners to local workmen who are clearly also, you know, immigrant communities or diaspora communities from Malta, from Italy, you know, I mean, we've got just a real cosmopolitan mix of folks there, but they are living locally full time in the urban center in Binzart, and then they're being brought in and hired as groups. And that, I mean, the fact that they're living in the cisterns, so they're away from their homes, they had to hire someone to cook for them, I imagine, right? There would be a certain amount of sort of like, we are going to the site to work, we come back to our camp, and someone should be watching the camp while we're away. You know, I mean, there probably were women, but I can't find any mention of them. In general, Utica is just much less well documented in Horton's papers. And part of me thinks maybe that's because Princeton has some papers from that chapter, or that I think Harvard is less likely, but I would be interested to see what they have. They have great finding aids, but I just haven't made it out there to physically visit the material yet. Caitlin Clerkin, who's a University of Michigan PhD student, has visited the Harvard collections, and she didn't mention coming across any of that, but she had different research questions in mind as well. So I still have hope that there would be some information on this, but it's clear that Horton, in his photographs, captures white Western women as traveling through the sites and so on, being present with their sweet little sun hats, but no images in the collection at the Kelsey Museum of local women in any form.
Thank you. And since you brought up Caitlin Clerkin, I just want to put in a plug for her excellent ASOR session, Museums and Social Justice. The Bade Museum presented in it last ASOR in the digital or the virtual session. We'll be presenting again on this project on Silencing the Archives in the
I'm so
virtual
glad.
session in October. So yeah, so she co-chairs that with Catherine. So yeah, just a little plug there for her.
Yes, please.
Yeah. A question from an audience member here, Antonella Mezzolani Andreose. She says, thank you very much. I'm very interested about the relationships between ONeill and Provok because I'm working on Provok's biography.
Oh my gosh, I would love to be in touch. Yeah, I'd be happy to share everything that I have on him. It is clear that they had a very close relationship, that he calls him the Count quite often, that they are, especially in 1924, I get the impression that he had sort of like he just saw ONeill as like a little apprentice, someone to shape and also pass off responsibility for some things. And there's a couple of really charming letters in which Horton is trying to sound cavalier, but it's sort of like, I went to say goodbye to the Count, and as he waved from the train, I was given to understand that I should oversee everything and that he trusted my judgment. And, I mean, how much of that was said and how much of that is Horton just sort of, I've been abandoned at Carthage for a week and I hope I can handle this. But there are some really interesting little moments of connection throughout his 2 years of coming and going. And it's clear that he admires Dvorak, and he makes no mention of the scandal surrounding his sort of fall from social graces in the larger academic community. Apparently, Horton ONeill either wasn't aware of it or else just like didn't want to give it any credence. But it does seem like the relationship is stronger in 1924 than in 1925, just based on how much he's mentioned. But please do either email me or, I don't know, find someone in this group. I would love to be in touch and send you everything I have, because I think I don't know a lot about him, but he's such a fascinating character. And I think looking at this from both perspectives in tandem would be really productive. Thanks for being here.
We'll wrap it up with one final question. You brought it up again, and I think your answer to the previous question. The Roman cisterns accommodations. I'm very curious about how this worked logistically. So it sounds like the main field workforce was camping out in cisterns on site. What were the Western team members doing? Were they also living in those accommodations? Or so we know a little bit about how much is being paid out for lodging. Now, could you elaborate on what you know from the archives about that?
Yeah, so it's a little tough to correlate. I can't tell you for sure at every excavation where Horton is staying. Like, I think when he's at Utica, which is where the workmen are living in the cisterns, he is, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I don't think I have any record of where he stayed during that particular excavation. It would have been a separate location. But I know for a fact that they are in much better accommodation everywhere they go. And in particular, they are living in a palace. I mean, it's called Palais Hamilcar, but it is an old sort of not perfectly kept up, but multi-roomed sort of stone mansion that happens to be owned by either the abbot like personally, or by the French Academy. So I think Kelsey sort of in his 1925 preliminary report describes like who, he thanks the person who owned that Palais Hamilcar, but certainly they are well sheltered. They have meals prepared for them. I don't know the details of how they did like lunch on site. I wish I did. But it seems like they're absolutely in segregated worlds. The workmen show up. They have to interact with Horton to get paid. They have to get sort of like deal with his, impression of how productive they are or should be day to day. He clearly is like, you're useless. You're fired. He's making big decisions about them based on their productivity, but they have no commentary about like how they're taking care of themselves, their transportation. they're completely segregated after the end of the workday? That's a great question, though. I wish I had more to say.
Really huge disparities there, which stands a bit in contrast to some of the situations that we've heard about in this lecture series in Palestine,
That's
where
true.
workers were either just going home to their local villages because they were from the area after the workday, or as Jeffrey pointed out, they were getting good medical care and being sent to specialists when needed, or even the team members themselves were treating themselves in medical care. So that seems to be quite a different situation. Yeah, so thanks so much. And
Yeah, thank you.
Aaron has a couple words.
Sure. Also, just want to voice my thanks. Such a fascinating topic and a great presentation. And also such an interesting, collection. And I love the fact that you presented it warts and all, so to speak, and have gone into, aspects also of, the ethics and how, of course, not only the legal standards have changed, but also ethical standards have changed. I mean, I think this happened when you first presented at ASOR, but the fact that he could, it's not even export. I mean, he could basically sort of smuggle out even human remains just blows me away as a modern person in the 21st century. But there you go. Lots has changed. And we were remarking, before your presentation also just sort of the sheer quantity of the materials, that were excavated between the two world wars. And then, how they were scattered. Some of them obviously remained in private hands for a long time. Just so much has changed. And to reiterate, how much can be learned with, turning modern eyes to these legacy materials, right? So thank you so much. And I just wanted to let our audience know that we will have our final contribution to this Unsilencing series coming on June 2nd. So also a Thursday. It'll be 9 a.m. California time when Elizabeth Miner will take us to Nubia. And we'll be speaking about decolonizing aspects of Reisner's work in what is today present-day Sudan. So we're moving from Tunisia to Sudan. We've had aspects of ancient Persia covered, and of course the Levant, and we'll wrap up our series on June 2nd. So thank you all, and thanks again to Professor Dixon for